Welcome to Stay Close. I am your host, Sarah Broussard, and I'm happy and grateful to be sharing this space with you today. This podcast has been quite a journey for me. I know I've spoken about this, but I think it's worth saying again. I've resisted doing this podcast, even though so many people in my world have encouraged me to do so. But as we know, we aren't going to do something until we absolutely feel like this is the right thing for us. And it's taken me this long to feel that. I know that the hesitation wasn't because I lacked ideas or passion, but because that familiar voice of insecurity kept whispering, why would you do that? What do you have to say that's important? What will people think of you? I imagine many of you have encountered these same doubts in your life. It's that pivotal moment, right, when you're ready to step forward into something new. Everything in you says, yes, it's a go. But then those inner critics, I call them the shitty committee, begin their ugly chatter. Well, that's exactly why I named this show Stay Close, inspired by David Whyte's beautiful poem, Courage. The poem speaks to perhaps the most courageous act we can undertake, which is staying close to how we were made. When you think about it, isn't it remarkable that the bravest thing we can do is simply be who we actually are? This idea of returning to our authentic selves isn't universal across all cultures, though. In some traditions, people never leave their essential nature in the first place. Why would they? Well, recently I was deeply moved by an interview with the First Nations people of Australia who maintain profound connections with their country. The interviewer asked the Aboriginal elder about returning to spiritual practice or leaving one's self. His response was amazing. It broke me open when I heard this. He was genuinely confused by the question. This elder had really no way of understanding what this guy was talking about. He simply couldn't grasp why anyone would ever separate from their essential nature in the first place. The concept itself didn't make sense within his worldview. It got me thinking about our Western culture and why we so often feel the need to constantly improve ourselves, as if who we are naturally isn't enough. What would life look like if we could release that pressure and trust that who we are is already whole and complete? Wow. Yeah. What would life be like if we could release that pressure and trust that who we are is already whole and complete? My shoulders go down all the way down my back on that one in relaxation. This cultural pressure to reinvent ourselves is something I've experienced firsthand. My own journey away from authenticity began at a very young age when I felt, too, that who I wasn't enough. Let me share a story that illustrates the experience of drifting away from your authentic self. When I was 13 and my mom left, the world really shifted for me. Everything shifted. Nothing was the same as it was before she left. So that summer, I thought I'd do something different than going to our home on the Cape. I really wanted to get away from any reminder, truthfully, of what had happened to our family. So I asked to go away to camp, and I went to this camp in northern New Hampshire called Camp Kinniawatha. It was a beautiful place. It was a camp as you'd imagine it, right? Beautiful, tall, tall pines, a gorgeous lake. There were happy voices, sweet little cabins all around. It was a perfect spot for me to become someone else. So I'm Sarah, but at camp, I told everybody to call me Muffy. I said that it was my nickname forever, which was completely made up. And get this, it didn't stop there. I then went on to invent a twin sister named Stacy. And I tell these elaborate stories about all the things we did together and how much she meant to me and how much I missed her at camp. It was weird, but part of me loved making up this story because it detached me from the sadness that I so desperately felt at that time. So there was freedom in it for me. It was a new place, it was a new name, it was a new life. And at that moment, it felt like there was no baggage attached to that. But what I realized was there was this trepidation. I was always on the edge, worried that I was going to slip up or say the wrong name or forget some detail of my fake life. And after a while, like keeping track of all those lies and false stories, they were just exhausting. It was exhausting. But I still continue to pretend to be Muffy with her perfect twin sister. And for some reason, this felt far safer than just being me, being Sarah, the girl whose mom just walked out. I just want to take a moment here because this is a time where I experience extraordinary vulnerability in just speaking about this story. My voice starts to skip a bit, and there's a strange feeling that I feel in revealing this, because this was something I had done to protect myself, but ultimately what I'd done was hurting me. It was taking me away from me, but at that time, it was the best that I could do. It was how I survived this devastating loss. But what I hadn't anticipated were the consequences of my deception. I didn't have any idea that the time would come when a certain friend from camp would want to come to Cape Cod so she could meet this fabulous twin sister of mine, Stacy. But that's what happened. And she had called, her family was vacationing nearby our town on Cape Cod, and she wanted to stop by. And I remember feeling like, oh my God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? What am I going to tell my dad? What am I going to tell my brothers? What am I going to do? Well, guess what? As the universe would have it, I had to come clean. And coming clean meant that I had to speak to my father truthfully about it, what I had done, then tell my brothers who thought it was just hysterical and made fun of me because it was so weird. And then ultimately having to tell my friend and her family, because of course my friend had been talking about this with her family. It was terrible. I mean, I get a pit in my stomach right now when I think about my 13-year-old self and the reality that I had to check in with around the truth in that moment. But reflecting on that part of my life, I wonder how many of you have had your own versions of the Muffy story. I wonder if there have been moments when you felt the pressure to hide your true self and possibly construct a persona that felt more acceptable or engaging or dynamic or humorous. or whatever. Maybe you've downplayed your own intelligence to fit in, feigned interest in activities for the sake of belonging, or insisted you were fine even as you struggled within. I have found that these moments teach us. They teach us the profound value of authenticity and the courage it takes to be unapologetically ourselves. Love that. Unapologetically, right? Oh, I love that word. We can do brave things. And the bravest and most courageous thing we can do is moving toward and staying close to the way we are made. I sure did learn that through these lessons, I'll tell you, at 13. But the truth is, these moments where we felt that we truly weren't enough happen a lot. I spent years trying to be someone I thought others would find more acceptable, more lovable. And I'm guessing I'm not alone in this. But here's what I've learned. Those masks we wear, those personas we adopt, they're incredibly heavy. They require constant maintenance, and most importantly, they keep us from experiencing the genuine connections that our hearts truly crave. The person I pretended to be gave me success, but took away my sense of wholeness. There was a liberating sense of freedom in becoming somebody new, unburdened by the past. Yet entwined with this freedom was an ever-present anxiety, a fear of tripping over my own fabrications, which is exactly what I felt I was carrying around, this burden of lies. So as funny as it is, because it's almost this full circle experience for me, where for so long as a young person, I armored up, I protected myself. I didn't want anybody to see through me because I feared that if they saw through me, they too would leave. And so this life that I have cultivated and weaved together on this healing path is all about taking off that armor and coming back to that place, that soft place of vulnerability and acceptance. And the most beautiful thing that I have discovered around that is that when we are vulnerable rather than armored up, people have a chance to relate to us. Because guess what? They are vulnerable too. And vulnerable is an open place. It's an open state. Just the other day, I heard somebody describe protecting yourself versus vulnerability. And what they said about it was that when we protect ourselves, when we have a shield around us that says, nope, you're not coming in, we are completely alone. No one can get in and out of that shield, that protection. We are alone underneath that armor. And yet, when we're vulnerable and we learn to trust, when we learn that we are enough, vulnerability is an open state. And when somebody witnesses our vulnerability, there is an opportunity to interact with people at that level. It's not a lonely place because so many people are also in that place of vulnerability and hoping and praying that they find someone that they can relate to in that tender place. After my experience with Muffy at Camp Kiniawatha, I spent years trying to understand why I felt the need to create the alternative identity. What was I running from? What did I think was so unacceptable about my true self? The answers weren't simple, but they were illuminating. Following my mother's departure, I was carrying immense grief and shame, emotions that felt too overwhelming to process as a young teenager. I've determined that creating Muffy was my way of escaping that pain, of pretending I came from a perfect, intact family. But here's the paradox. In trying to escape my pain by creating this fictional self, I actually doubled my pain. Now I had both the original wound and the exhaustion of maintaining a false identity. Whoa. It was pretty heavy. And guess what? This pattern followed me into my adulthood. I became an expert at shape shifting, being whoever I thought others wanted me to be. In professional settings, I was ultra competitive and unflappable. And then in social circles, I was the reliable friend who never needed help. And then in romantic relationships, I morphed into whatever I thought my partner desired. It wasn't until my first initiation, as I call it, right? When I was in bed for 2 weeks with pneumonia when I was 32, that I started to understand that this duality was taking me down. I remember sitting on my apartment floor once, surrounded by tissues, and having this crystal clear realization that I did not know who I was anymore. Yeah. That moment became my invitation to begin journeying back to myself, to stay close to how I was made. I didn't really understand as much as I do now about how I was going to do that, but I knew that I was in pain and it was not sustainable. I think that's enough, right? I think that's enough. We don't have to get all deep and into it in the beginning. So in the beginning, it's just identifying like what is screaming the loudest in you and what small step can I take toward that pain and do something about it. I began to rediscover parts of myself that I had abandoned. Yeah, I remembered that I loved poetry. I loved walking in nature in the early mornings. I remembered the connection that I had to my heart through empathy and intuition. And then there were the next steps, which weren't easy, but they were moving me in the right direction. And they were years of therapy, developing a meditation practice, finding the discipline through a Kundalini yoga teacher training. And then what felt like endless years of moving my attention toward myself rather than away. The thing is, it has worked. It has been something that has been so illuminating that truthfully, I don't know what I would have done with my life had I not been directed in the way I've been directed. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it did take a huge physical event and also just the unsuccessful experiences of that duality of carrying around the original wound and then the support of trying to keep up this alternative identity. And while it wasn't as outrageous as creating somebody like Muffy in my life, there were always real nuances around how I would interact with myself. It was never really with confidence. It was always giving my power away. I guess that's what I'd like to say. I was always giving my power away. But after turning toward myself and doing what I considered very deep work, excavating the way that I interacted with my life, and coming to a place that felt so very different, something miraculous happened. I became more authentically myself. And from there, my relationships deepened. The people that belonged in my life were drawn to me because they could see my true and genuine self, not the crafted persona that I was interacting with prior to this. I think that's what David Whyte means when he talks about staying close. It's about having the courage to honor your small truths. The quiet knowing inside you that has always been there and will always be there, even when you can't touch it. So where does this leave us now? How do we begin to stay close to ourselves in a culture that often encourages the opposite? Well, I believe it starts with small acts of authenticity. Maybe it's speaking up when you disagree, even if your voice shakes. Or maybe it's admitting when you don't know something instead of pretending something. Could be as simple as wearing clothes that make you feel like yourself rather than what's trendy or what your friends are wearing. Yeah, these small acts, they create a pathway back to you with a capital Y. They're like breadcrumbs guiding you home. So in the upcoming episodes of this podcast, I'd like to explore different aspects of staying close to ourselves. I'd like to talk about recognizing when we've strayed from our authentic path and what it feels like in your body, in your heart, in your spirit when you put one foot in front of the other on the path of your dreams, on the path toward your North Star. We're going to discuss the courage it takes to be vulnerable. And we'll share stories from people who have found their way back to themselves after living years behind these heavy masks. Before we wrap up today, though, I'd like to leave you with a simple practice that has helped me immensely in my own journey. Now, each evening, take a few moments to reflect on your day and ask yourself, when did I feel most alive today? And then, when did I feel most connected to myself and others? And when did I feel most at peace? These moments of alignedness are signposts. They're showing you where you're already staying close to your authentic self. So pay attention, because you will know. Your body, your mind, your spirit will let you know you are on the right path. I want to thank you for joining me for this particular episode of Stay Close, where I share things I've never shared before. And I hope something in my story resonated with you. And I hope you'll join me next episode when we'll be discussing the early warning signs that we're moving away from our authentic selves. Until then, I invite you to notice the small moments when you feel truly yourself. And remember, the most courageous thing you can do is simply to stay close to how you were made.
Fire under.
This is Sarah Broussard, and you've been listening to Stay Close. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear this message. Stay close, everyone.